Hello, my dear students. Welcome to Teacher at Home. Today, class, we are going to learn the fourth chapter, the age of industrialization. In 19, a popular music publisher, E.T. Powell, produced a music book that had a picture on the cover page announcing the dawn of the century. As you see from illustration at the center of the picture, it is goddess-like figure, the angel of progress, bearing the flag of the new century. She is gently perched on a wheel with wings symbolizing time. The flight is taking her into the future. Floating about behind her are the signs of the progress railway, camera, machines, printing press, and factory. This glorification of machines and technology is even more marked in a picture which appeared on the pages of a trade magazine over 100 years ago. It shows two magicians. The one at the top is Aladdin from the Orient who built a beautiful palace with his magic lamp. New Words is Orient, the countries to the east of the Mediterranean, usually referring to the Asia. The term arises out of the Western viewpoint that sees this region as pre-modern, traditional, and mysterious. The one at the bottom is the modern mechanic, who with his modern tools weaves a new magic, builds bridges, ships, towers, and high-rise buildings. Aladdin is shown as representing the East and the past. The mechanic stands for the West and modernity. These images offer us the triumphant account of the modern world. Within the account of the modern world is associated with rapid technological change, innovations, machines and factories, railways and steamships. The history of industrialization thus becomes simply a story of development, and the modern age appears as a wonderful time of technological progress. These images and associations have now become part of popular imagination. Do you not see rapid industrializations as a time of progress and modernity? Do you think that the spread of railways and factories, construct of high-rise buildings and bridges is a sign of society's development? How have these images developed? And how do we relate to these ideas? Is industrialization always based on rapid technological development? Can we today continue to glorify continuous mechanism of all work? What has industrialization meant to people's lives? To answer such question, we need to turn to the history of industrialization. In this chapter, we look at the history by focusing first on Britain, the first industrial nation, and then India, where the pattern of industrial change was conditioned by colonial rule. Before the Industrial Revolution, all too often we associate industrialization with the growth of factory industry. When we talk of industrial production, we refer to factory production. When we talk of industrial workers, we mean factory workers. Histories of industrialization very often begin with the setting up of first factories. There is a problem with such ideas. Even before factories began to dot the landscape in England and Europe, there was large scale industrial production for an international market. This was not based on factories. Many historians now refer to the phase of industrialization as proto industrialization. Proto meaning indicating the first or early form of something. In the 17th and 18th century, merchants from the towns in Europe began moving to the countryside, supplying money to peasants and artisans, persuading them to produce for an international market. With the expansion of world trade and acquisition of colonies in different parts of the world, the demand for goods began growing. But merchants could not expand production within towns. This was because here urban crafts and trade guilds were powerful. These were associations of producers that trained craftspeople, maintained control over production, regulated competition and prices, and restricted the entry of new people into the trade. Rulers granted different guilds that monopoly right to produce and trade in specific products. It was therefore difficult for new merchants to set up business in towns, so they turned into countryside. In the countryside, poor peasants and artisans began working for merchants. As you have seen in the textbook last year, there was a time when open fields were disappearing and commons were being enclosed. Cottagers and poor peasants, who had earlier depended on common lands for their survival, gathering their firewood, berries, vegetables, hay, and straw, had to now look for alternative sources of income. Many had tiny plots of land which could not provide work for all members of their household. So when merchants came around and offered advances to produce goods for them, peasant households eagerly agreed. By working for the peasants or the merchants, they could remain in the countryside and continue to cultivate their small plots. Income from proto industrial production supplemented their shrinking income from cultivation. It also allowed them a fuller use of the family labor resources. Stapler, a person who staples or sorts wool according to its fiber. Fuller, a person who fulls, that is, gathers cloth by pleating. Carding, the process in which fibers such as cotton or wool are prepared prior to spinning. Within this system, a close relationship developed between the town and the countryside. Merchants were based in towns, but the work was not done mostly in the countryside. A merchant clothier in England purchased wood from the wood stapler, carried it into the spinners, the yarn thread that was spun and taken into subsequent stages of production to weavers, fullers, and then to dyers. The finishing was done in London before the export merchant sold the cloth in international market. London, in fact, came to be known as the finishing center. This proto-industrial system was a part of the network of commercial exchanges. It was controlled by merchants and the goods were produced by a vast number of producers working with their family firms and not in industries. At each rate of production, 20 to 25 workers were employed by each merchant. This meant that each clothier was controlling hundreds of workers. The coming up of a factory. The earliest factories in England came up by the 1730s, but it was only in the late 18th century that the number of factories multiplied. The first symbol of the new era was cotton. Its production boomed in the last 19th century. In 1760, Britain was importing 2.5 million pounds of raw cotton to feed its cotton industry. By 1787, this import soared to 22 million pounds. This increase was linked to a number of changes within the process of production. Let us look briefly at some of these. A series of inventions in the 18th century increased the efficiency of each step of the production process, carding, twisting, and spinning and rolling. They enhanced the output per worker, enabling each worker to produce more, and they made possible the production of stronger reeds, threads, and yarn. Then Richard Arkwright created the cotton mill. Till this time, as you have seen, cloth production was spread all over the countryside and carried out within village households. But now the costly new machines could be purchased, set up, and maintained in the mill. Within the mill, at the artist said, seen through the humid atmosphere that makes Lancashire the best cotton spinning locality in the world, a huge cotton mill, aglow with electricity in the twit as a most impressive sight. Processes were brought together under one roof and management. This allowed a more careful supervision over the production process, a watch over quality and the regulation of labor, all of which had been difficult to do when production was in the countryside. In the early 19th century, factories increasing became an intimate part of the English landscape, so visible were the imposing new mills. So magical seemed to be the power of new technology that contemporaries was dazzled. They concentrated their attention on the mills, almost forgetting the bylanes and the workshops where production still continued. The way in which the historian focused on the industrialization rather than on small workshops is a good example of how that we believe today about the past is influenced by which historians choose to notice and what they ignore. No doubt one event or aspect of their own life which adults such as the parents and teachers may think is unimportant but which you believe to be important. Chimneys blowing smoke came to the characteristic the industrial landscape. The pace of industrial change. How rapid was the process of industrialization? Does industrialization mean only the growth of factory industries? First, the most dynamic industries in Britain were clearly cotton and metals. Growing at a rapid pace, cotton was the leading sector in the first phase of industrialization up to the 1840s. After the iron and steel industry led the way with the expansion of railways in England from the 1840s and the colonies from 1860s, the demand for iron and steel increased rapidly. By 1873, Britain was exporting iron and steel worth about 77 million, double the value of its cotton export. Second, the new industries could not easily displace traditional industries. Even at the end of the 19th century, Less than 20% of the total workforce was employed in technologically advanced industrial sectors. Textile was a dynamic sector, but a large portion of the output was produced not within industries but outside within domestic units. Third, the pace of change in the traditional industries was not set by steam powered cotton or metal industries, but they did not remain entirely stagnant either. Seemingly ordinary and small innovations were the basis of growth in many non mechanized sectors such as food processing, building, pottery, glasswork, tanning, furniture, making, and production of implements. Fourth, the technological change occurred slowly. They did not spread dramatically across the industrial landscape. New technology was expensive, amateurs and industrialists were cautious about using it. The machines often broke out and repair was costly. They was not as effective as the inventors and manufacturers claimed. Consider the case of the steam engine. James Watt improved the steam engine produced by new uh, women patented the new engine in 1781. New common. His industrialist friend Matthew Boulton manufactured the new model. But for years he could find no buyers at the beginning of the 19th century. There were no more than 321 steam engines all over England. Of these 80 were in cotton industry, 9 in wool industry, and the rest in mining, canal works, and iron works. Steam engines were not used in any of these other industries till much later in the century. So even the most powerful new technology that enhanced the productivity of labor manifold was slow to be accepted by industrialists. Historians now have come to increasingly recognize that the typical worker in the mid 19th century was not a machine operator but the traditionally craftsman and laborer. Hand labor and steam power. In Victorian Britain, there was no shortage of human labor. Poor peasants and vagrants moved to the cities in large numbers in search of jobs waiting for work. As you will know, when there is a plenty of labor, wages are low, so industrialists had no problem of labor shortage or high wage cost. They did not want to introduce machines that got rid of human labor and required large capital investment. Many industries, the demand for labor was seasonal. Gasworks and breweries were especially busy through the cold months. So they needed more workers to meet their peak demand. Bookbinders and printers catering to Christmas demand too needed extra hands before December. At the waterfront, winter was the time that ships were repaired and spruced up. In all such industries where production fluctuated with the season, industrialists used preferred hand labor, employing workers for the season. A range of products could be produced only with hand labor. Machines were oriented to producing uniform, standardized goods for a mass market. But the demand in the market was often for goods with intricate designs and specific shapes. The mid 19th century, Britain, for instance, 500 varieties of Wilthorne is one of those who went in search of seasonal work, loading bricks and doing all jobs. He described how job seekers walked to London in search of work. I had always wanted to go to London, and my desire was stimulated by letters from an old workmate who was now working at the Old Kent Road gas works. I finally decided to go in November 1881. With two friends, I started out to work the journey, filled with the hope that we would be able to obtain employment when we get there with the kind assistance of my friend. We had little money when we started, not enough to pay for our food and lodgings each night until we arrived in London. Some days we walked as much as 20 miles and other days less. Our money was gone at the end of the third day, but two nights we slept out, once under a haystack and once in the old farm shed. On arrival in London, we tried to find my friend but were unsuccessful. Our money was gone, so there was something for us to do but to walk around until late at night and then try to find some place to sleep. We found an old building and slept it in that night. The next day, Sunday, late in the afternoon, we got in the old Kent gas works and applied for work. To my great surprise, the man we had been looking for was working at the time. He spoke to the foreman and was given a job. Cotton in the Raphael Samuel corners and Govers in H.A. Dewars and Michael Wolff Ed's The Victorian City Images and Relatives, 1973. Hammers and were produced and 45 kinds of axes. This required human skill, not mechanical technology. In Victorian Britain, the upper classes, the aristocrats, and the bureaucracy preferred things produced by hand. Handmade products came to symbolize refinement and class. They were better finished, individually produced, and carefully designed. Machine made goods were for export to the colonies. In countries with labor shortage, industrialists were keen on using mechanical power so that the need for human labor can be minimized. This was the case in 19th century America. Britain, however, had no problem hiring human hands. Life of the workers. The abundance of labor in the market affected the life of workers as news of possible jobs traveled to the countryside, hundreds ran to the cities. The actual possibility of getting a job depended on existing network of friendship and in keen relations. If you had a relative or a friend in a factory, you were more likely to get a job quickly. But not everyone had social connections. Many job seekers had to wait weeks, spending nights until the bridges or in night shelters. Some stayed in night refuges that were set up by private individuals. Others went to the casual wards maintained by the poor law authorities. Seasonality of work in many industries meant prolonged periods without work. After the busy season was over, the poor were on the streets again. Some returned to the countryside after the winter when the demand for labor in the rural areas opened up in places. But most looked for odd jobs, which till the mid 19th century were difficult to find. Wages increased somewhat in the early 19th century, but they tell us little about the welfare of the workers. Average figures hide the variations between trade and the fluctuations from year to year. For instance, when prices rose sharply during the prolonged Napoleonic War, the real value of what the workers earned fell significantly since the same wages could now buy fewer things. Moreover, the income of workers depended not on the wage rate alone. What was also critical was the period of employment. The number of days of work determined the average daily income of the workers. At the best of times, till the mid 19th century, about 10% of the urban population were extremely poor. The periods of economic slump, like the 1830s, the proportion of unemployed went up to anything between 35 and 75% in different regions. The fear of unemployment made workers hostile to the introduction of new technology. When the spinning journey was introduced, when the spinning jenny was introduced in a drawing by the T. Nicholson 1835 noticed the number of spindles that could be operated with one wheel. Spinning jenny. Devised by James Hargreaves in 1764, this machine speeded up the spinning process and reduced labor demand. By turning one single wheel on a worker, could set in motion of a number of spindles and spin several threads at the same time. A magistrate reported in 1790 about an incident that he was called in to protect a manufacturer's property from being attacked by workers. From the depredations of a lawless banditry of colliers and their wives, for the wives had lost their work for spinning engines, they advanced as far as with much insolence, owing their intention to cutting to pieces the machine lately introduced in the wooden manufacture, which they suppose, if gently adopted, will lessen the demand for manual labor. The women became clamorous, the men were more open to conviction, and after some expostulations were induced to desist from their purpose and return peacefully home. A shallow underground railway being constructed in central London. From the 1850s, railway stations being coming up all over London, they meant a demand for a large number of workers. They dig tunnels, erect timber scaffolding, or do the brick and the iron works. Job seekers moved from one construction site to another. The wooden industry, women who were survived on hand spinning, began attacking the new machines. This conflict over the introduction of the jenny continued for a long time. After the 1840s, building activity intensified the cities, opening up greater opportunities of employment. Roads were widened, new railway stations came up, railway lines were extended, tunnel dug, drainage and sewers laid, overs embedded. The number of workers employed in the transport industry doubled in 1840s and doubled again in the subsequent 30 years. Industrializations in the colonies. Let us now move to India to see how a colony industrializes. Once again, we look not only for the industrial factory industry but also at the non mechanized sector. We will limit our discussion primarily to textile industries. The age of textile industry, Indian textiles. Before the age of machine industries, silk and cotton good from India dominated the international market in textiles. Coarser cottons were produced in many industries, but the finer varieties often came from India. Armenian and Persian merchants took the goods from Punjab to Afghanistan, Eastern Persia, and Central Asia. Bales of fine textiles were carried on camelback via the northwest frontier through mountain passes and across deserts. A vibrant sea trade operated through the main pre-colonial ports. Surat on the Gujarat coast connected India to the Gulf and Red Sea ports. Masulipatanam on the Coromandel coast, Hooghly in Bengal had trade links with the Southeast Asian ports. A variety of Indian merchants and bankers were involved in this network of export trade, financing production, carrying goods, and supplying exporters. Supply merchants linked the port towns to the inland regions. They gave advances to weavers, procured to woolen cloth from the weaving villages, and carried the supply of the ports. At the port, the big shippers and export merchants had brokers who negotiated the price and brought goods from the supply merchants operating land. By the 1750s, this network, controlled by Indian merchants, was breaking down. The European company gradually gained power, first securing a variety of concessions from local courts, then the monopoly rights to trade. This resulted in a decline of the old ports of Surat and Hooghly, through which local merchants have operated. Exports from these ports fell dramatically. The credit that had financed the earlier trade began drying up, and the local bankers slowly went bankrupt. In the last years of the 17th century, the gross value of trade that passed through Surat had been rupees 16 million. By the 1740s, it had slumped to 3 million. When Surat and Hooghly decayed, Bombay and Calcutta grew. The shift from the old ports to the new ones was an indicator of the growth of colonial power. Trade through the new ports came to be controlled by European companies and was carried in European ships, while many of the old trading houses collapsed. Those that wanted to survive had to now operate within the network shaped by European trading companies. How did the changes affect the life of weavers and the other artisans? What happened to weavers? The consolidation of East India Company power after the 1760s did not initially lead to decline in textile exports from India. British cotton industry had to be expanded, and Indian fine textiles were in great demand in Europe. So the company was keep on expanding textiles imports from exports from India. Before establishing political power in Bengal, Carnatic in the 1760s and 1770s, the East India Company had found it difficult to ensure a regular supply of food for export. The French, Dutch, Portuguese, as well as the local traders completed in the market to secure women, woven clothes, so the weaver and supply merchants would begin bargain and try selling the produce of the best buyer. In their letter back to London, company officials continually complained to difficulty of supply and the high prices. However, once the East India Company established political power, it could assert a monopoly right to trade. It proceeded to develop a system of management and control that would eliminate competition, control costs, and ensure regular supplies of cotton and silk goods. This it did through a series of steps. First, the company tried to eliminate the existing traders and brokers connected with the cotton cloth trade and establish a more direct control over the weaver. It appointed a paid servant called the Commissar to supervise weavers, collect supplies, and examine the quality of cloth. Second, it prevented company weavers from dealing with other buyers. One way of doing this was through the system of advances. Once an order was placed, the weavers were given loans to purchase the raw material for their production. Those who took loans have to hand over the cloth they produced to the Gomastu. They could not take it to any other trader. As loans flowed in and demand for fine textiles expanded, weavers eagerly took the advances, hoping to earn more. Many weavers had small plots of land, which they had earlier cultivated along with weaving, and they produced from this took care of their family needs. Now they had to lease out the land and devote all their time to weaving. Weaving, in fact, required the labor of the entire family, with children and women all engaged in different stages of this process. Soon, however, in many weaving villages, There were reports of clashes between weavers and Gamastu. Earlier supply merchants had very often lived within the weaving villages and had a close relationship with the weavers, looking after their needs and helping them in times of crisis. The new Gamastas were outsiders and with no long term social link with the village. They acted arrogantly, marched into the villages with sepoys and peons, and punished weavers for delays in supply, often beating and flogging them. The weavers lost the space to bargain for prices and sell to different buyers. The price they received from the company were miserably low, and the loans were had accepted tied them to the company. Sepoy, this is how the British pronounce the word. Sipahi, meaning an Indian soldiers in the service of the British. In many places in Carnatic and Bengal, weavers deserted villages and migrated, setting up looms in other villages where they had some family relation. Elsewhere, weavers, along with the village traders, revolted, opposing the company and its official. Over time, many weavers began refusing loans, closing down their workshops, and taking to agricultural labor. By the turn of the 19th century, cotton weavers faced a new set of problems. Manchester comes to India. In 1772, Henry Patullo, a company official, had ventured to say that the demand for Indian textiles could never reduce since no other nation produced goods of the same quality. Yet by the beginning of the 19th century, we see the beginning of the long decline of textile exports from India. In 1811 and 12, these goods accounted for 33% of India's exports. By 1850 and 51, it was no more than 3%. Why did this happen? What were its implications? As cotton industry developed in England, industrial groups began worrying about imports from other countries. They pressurized the government to impose import duties on cotton textile so that Manchester goods could sell in Britain without facing any competition from outside. At the same time, industrialists persuaded the East India Company to sell British manufactures in Indian market as well. Exports of British cotton goods increased dramatically in the early 19th century. At the end of the 18th century, there had been virtually no import of cotton piece goods into India. But by 1850, cotton piece goods constituted about 31% of the value of Indian imports, and by the 1850s, their figure was 50%. Cotton weavers in India thus faced two problems at the same time. The export market collapsed and the local share market shrank, being glutted with Manchester imports. Produced by machines at low cost, the imported cotton goods were so cheap that weavers could not easily compete with them. By the 1850s, reports from most weaving regions of India narrated story of decline and dissolution. By the 1860s, weavers faced a new problem. They could not get sufficient supply of raw cotton of good quality. The Commissioner of Patna wrote, "It appears that 20 years ago a brisk trade was carried on the manufacture of cloth at Jehanabad and Bega, which was in the former place entirely ceased, while in the latter the amount of manufacture is very limited, the consequence of the cheap and durable goods from Manchester, with which the native manufacturers were unable to compete." Reporting to the Koshis, a community of weavers, the census report of central provinces stated, "The Koshis, like the weavers of the finer kinds of cloth in the other parts of India, have fallen upon evil times. They were unable to compete with the showy goods, with Manchester sons in such provisions, and there had years emigrated in great numbers chiefly to bear what was day laborers that were unable to obtain wages." Census report of Central Provinces 1872 quoted in Sumit's Guha, The Handloom Industry in Central India 1825 to 50, The Indian Economic and Social History Review. Bombay and Calcutta grew on the trading ports from 1780s, this market of the decline of the old trading order and the growth of the colonial economy. Civil war broke out and cotton supplies from the US were cut off. Britain turned to India. As raw cotton exports from India increased, the price of raw cotton shot up. Weavers in India were starved at supplies and forced to buy raw cotton at exorbitant prices. In this situation, weaving could not pay. Then, by the end of the 19th century, weavers and other craftsmen faced yet another problem. Factories in India began production flooding market with machine goods. How could weaving industry possibly survive? Factories come up. The first cotton mill in Bombay came up in 1854 and went into production 2 years later. By 1862, four mills were at work with 94,000 spindles and 2,150 looms. Around the same time, jute mills came up in Bengal, the first being set up in 1855. and the other one 7 years later in 1862. North India, Delhi mill was started in Kanpur in the 1860s, and a year later the first cotton mill of Allahabad was set up, Ahmedabad. By 1874, the first spinning and weaving mill of Madras began production. Who set up the industries? Who were the capital came from? Who came to work in the mills? Early entrepreneurs. Industries were set up in different regions by varying sorts of people. Let us see they were. History of many businessmen groups goes back to the trade with China. From the late 18th century, as you have read in your book last year, the British in India began exploring, exporting opium to China and took tea from China to England. Many Indians began junior players in this trade, providing finance, procuring supplies, and shipping consignments. Having earned through trade, some of these businessmen had visions of developing industrial enterprises in India. In Bengal, Dwarkanath Tagore made his fortune in the China trade before he turned to industrial investment, setting up six joint stock companies in the 1830s and 1840s. Tagore's enterprises sang along with those of others in the wider businessman crisis of the 1840s, but later in the 19th century, many of the China traders became successful industrialists. In Bombay, passes like Dinsha Petit and Jamshedji Sarvanji Tata, who built huge industrial empires in India, accumulated their initial wealth partially from exports to China and partially from raw cotton shipments to England. Seth Hukumchand, a Marwari businessman who set up the first Indian jute mill in Calcutta in 1917, also traded with China. So did the father, as well as the grandson of the grandfather of the famous industrialist G.D. Birla. Capital was accumulated through other trade networks. Some merchants from Madras traded with Burma, while others had links with the Middle East and East Africa. There were yet another commercial groups, but they were not directly involved in external trade. They operated within India, carrying goods from one place to another, banking money, transferring funds between cities, and financing traders. When opportunities of investment in industries opened up, many of them set up factories. As colonial control over Indian trade tightened, the space within which Indian merchants could function became increasingly limited. They were barred from trading with Europe in manufactured goods and had to export mostly raw materials and food grains. Raw cotton, opium, wheat, and indigo required by the British. They were also gradually edged out of the shipping business. Till the First World War, European managing agencies in fact controlled large sector of Indian industries. Three of the biggest ones were Bird Hegglers and Co., Andrew Joule and Jardine Skinner and Co. These agencies mobilized capital, set up joint stock companies, and managed them. In most instances, Indian financiers provided the capital while the European agencies made all investment and business decisions. The European merchant industries have their own chambers of commerce, which Indian businessmen were not allowed to join. Where did the workers come from? Factories needed workers. With the expansion of factories, this demand increased. 1901, there were 5,84,000 workers in Indian factories. By 1946, the number was over 2 lakh 24 lakh 36,000. Where did the workers come from? In most industrial regions, workers came from the districts around. Peasants and artisans who found no work in the village went to the industrial centers in search of work. Of 50% workers in the Bombay cotton industries in 1911 came from the neighboring district of Ratnagiri, while the mills of Kanpur got most of their textile hands from the villages within the districts of Kanpur. Most often, mill workers moved between the village and the city, returning to their village homes during harvest and festivals. Over time, as news of employment spread, workers traveled great distances in the hope of work in the mills. From the United Provinces, for instance, they went to work in the textile mills of Bombay and in the jute mills of Calcutta. Partners in enterprise J. Tata, Adi Tata, Sri R.G. Tata, and Sir D.J. Tata. In 1912, J. Tata set up the first iron and steel works in India at Jamshedpur. Iron and steel industry in India started much later than textiles. In colonial India, industrial machinery, railways, and locomotives were mostly imported, so capital goods industries could not really develop in any significant way till independence. Young workers of Bombay Mill early 20th century. When workers went back to the village homes, they liked dressing up. Getting jobs was also difficult. Even mills multiplied and the demand for workers increased. The numbers seeking work were always more than the works available. Entry into the mills was also restricted. Industrialists usually employed a robber to get new recruits. Very often, the jobber was an old and trusted worker. He got people from his village, ensured them jobs, helped them settle in the city, and provided them money in times of crisis. The jobber therefore became a person with some authority and power. He began demanding money and gifts for his favors and controlling the lives of workers. The number of factory workers increased over time. However, as you will see, they were a small proportion of the total industrial workforce. Vasant Parker, who was once a mill worker in Bombay, said the workers would pay the jobbers money to get their sons work in the mill. The mill worker was closely associated with his village physically and emotionally. He would go home to cut the harvest and for sowing. The Konkani would go home to cut the paddy and the gatti, sugar cane. It was an accepted practice for which the mills granted leave. Meena Manon and Neera Adarkar, 100 Years, 100 Voices, 2004. A head jobber, notice how the posture and clothes emphasizes the jobber's position of authority. By Bosley, a trader, unionist of Bombay, recollected his childhood in 1930s and 40s. In those days, the shift was 10 hours from 5 p.m. to 3 a.m. That is terrible working hours. My father worked for 35 years. He got asthma like disease and could not work anymore. Then my father went back to village. Spinners at work in Ahmedabad, women worked mostly in the spinning departments. Peculiarities of industrial growth. European managing agencies, which dominated industrial production in India, were interested in certain kinds of products. Established tea and coffee plantations, securing land at cheap rates from the colonial government, and they invested in mining indigo and jute. Most of these were products required primarily for export trade and not for sale in India. When Indian businessmen began setting up industries in the late 19th century, they avoided competing with Manchester goods in the Indian market. Since yarn was not an important part of British imports into India, the early cotton mills in India produced coarse cotton yarn rather than fabric. When yarn was imported, it was only of the superior variety. The yarn produced in Indian spinning mill was used by handloom weavers in India or exported in China. By the first decade of the 20th century, a series of changes affected the pattern of industrialization. As the Swadeshi movement gathered momentum, nationalists mobilized people to boycott foreign clothes. Industrial groups organized themselves to protect their collective interest, pressuring the government to increase tariff protection and grant other concessions. From 1906, moreover, the export of Indian yarn to China declined since produce from Chinese to Japanese mills flooded in Chinese markets, so industrialists in India began shifting from yarn to cloth production. Cotton piece goods production in India doubled between 19 and 1912. Yet till the First World War, industrial growth was slow. The war created a dramatically new situation. With the British mills busy with the war production to meet the needs of the army, Manchester imports into India declined. Suddenly, Indian mills are the first home market to supply. As the war prolonged, Indian factories were called upon to supply war needs, jute bags, cloth for army uniforms, tents and leather boots, horse and mule saddles and a host of other items. New factories were set up and old ones can multiply shifts. Many new workers were employed and everyone was made to work long hours. Over the war years, industrial production boomed. After the war, Manchester could never recapture its old position in the Indian market. Unable to modernize and compete with the US, Germany, and Japan, economy of Britain crumbled after the war. Cotton production collapsed and exports of cotton cloth from Britain fell dramatically. Within the colonies, local industrialists gradually consolidated their position, substituting foreign manufacturers and capturing home market. Small scale industries predominate. While factory industries grew steadily after the war, large industries formed. only a small segment of the economy. Most of them, about 67% in 1911, were located in Bengal and Bombay. Over the rest of the country, small scale production continued to predominate. Only a small proportion of the total industrial labor force worked in registered factories, 5% in 1911 and 10% in 1931. The rest worked in small workshops and household units, often located in alleys and bylanes, invisible to the passerby. In fact, in some instances, handicraft production actually expanded in the 20th century. This is true even in the case of handloom sector that we have discussed. While cheap machine made thread wiped out of the spinning industry in the 19th century, the weavers survived despite problems. In the 19th 20th century, handloom cloth production expanded steadily, almost trebling between 19 and 1940. How did this happen? This was partially because of technological changes. Handicraft people adopt new technology if that helps them improve production without excessively pushing up cost. So by the second decade of the 20th century, we find weavers using looms with a fly shuttle. This increased productivity per worker, speeded up production, and reduced labor demand. By 1941, over 35% of handlooms in India were fitted with fly shuttles in regions like Travancore, Madras, Mysore, Cochin, Bengal. The proportion was 70 to 80%. There were several other small innovations that helped weavers improve their productivity and compete with the mill sector. Fly shuttle. It is a mechanical device used for weaving, moved by means of ropes and pulleys. It places the horizontal threads called the weft and the vertical threads called the warp. Invention of the fly shuttle made it possible for weavers to operate large looms and weave wide pieces of cloth. Certain group of weavers were in the better position than others to survive the competition with mill industries. Among weavers, some produced coarse clothes with others were finer varieties. The coarser cloth was bought by the poor and the demand fluctuated violently. In times of bad harvests and famines, when the rural people had little to eat, their cash income disappeared. They could not possibly buy clothes. The demand for the finer varieties bought by the well to do was more stable. The rich could buy this even when the poor starved. Famines did not affect the sale of Banarasi or Baluchari saris. Moreover, as you have seen, mills could not imitate specialized weave saris with woven borders or the famous lugis and handkerchiefs of Madras could not be easily displaced by mill production. Weavers and other craft people who continued to expand production through the 20th century did not necessarily prosper. They lived hard lives and worked long hours. Very often, the entire household, including all the women and the children, had to work in various stages of the production process. But they were not simply remnants of past times in the age of factories. Their life and labor was integral to the process of industrialization. Sixth is the market for goods. We have seen the British manufacturers attempting to take over the Indian market, how Indian weavers and craftsmen, traders and industrialists resisted colonial controls and demanded tariff protection, created their own spaces and tried to extend the market for their produce. But when new products are produced, people have to be persuaded to buy them. They have to feel like using the product. How was this done? One way in which new consumers are created is through advertisement. As you know, advertisement make products appear desirable and necessary. They try to shape the minds of the people and create new needs. Today, we live in a world where advertisements surround us. They appear in newspapers, magazines, boarding, street walls, television screens. If we look back into the history, we find that from the very beginning of the industrial age, advertisements have played a part in expanding the markets of products and in shaping a new consumer culture. When Manchester Industrialised began selling clothes in India, they put labels on the cloth bundles. The label was needed to make the place of manufacturer and the name of the company familiar to the buyer. The label was also a mark of quality. When buyers saw made in Manchester written in bold on the label, they were expected to feel confident about buying the cloth. But labels did not only carry words and text, they also carried images and very often beautifully illustrated. If we look at the old labels, we can have some idea of the mind of the manufacturers, their calculation, and the way they appeal to the people. Images of Indian gods and goddesses regularly appeared on these labels. It was as if the association with gods gave divine approval to the goods being sold. The imprinted image of Krishna or Saraswati was also intended to make the manufacture from a foreign land appear somewhat familiar to Indian people. By the late 19th century, manufacturers were printing calendars to popularize their products. Unlike newspapers and magazines, calendars are also used even by people who could not read. They were hung in tea shops and in poor people's houses just as much as in officers' middle class apartments. And those who had hung the collectors had to see the advertisement day after day through the year. In this calendar, once again, we see the figures of gods being used to sell new products. Like the images of gods, figures of important personages of emperors and nawabs adorned advertisement and calendar, the message very often seemed to say, if you respect the royal figure, then respect this product. When the product was being used by the king or produced under royal command, its quality could not be questioned. When Indian manufacturers advertised, the national message was clear and loud. If you are care for the nation, then buy products that Indian produce. Advertisements became a vehicle of the nationalist message of Swadeshi. Conclusion: clearly, the age of industries have meant major technological changes, growth for factories, and making a new industrial labor force. However, as you have seen, hand technology and small scale production remained important part of the industrial landscape. So that's all about this chapter. If you are interested, please do like, share, and subscribe my channel. Okay, thank you.